So this is our phase 3 Performing Arts Center feasibility study. You might remember results of phase 1 and phase 2. And I'm going to let Duncan Webb, who is involved with phase 2, and now is going to present the findings of phase 3 and how feasible it really is.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good evening, Mayor, members of Council. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and present our work to you. I am a management consultant to people who build and operate cultural facilities. I've been doing this for 30 years. In our practice, we just started our 430th assignment, feasibility studies and strategic planning. We are unique, our firm, because all of myself and my staff all have this sort of schizophrenic background that we've worked professionally in the arts, but we also have sort of business arts admin training to sort of speak both sides. I wrote a book in 2005. This is the first book written on how to operate a multi-user performing arts venue. I'm up to my knees now in writing that second edition that will come out this June. The other thing I would say about our practice is that we just offer ourselves to do this front-end work. So we're finished after tonight, which is bad for me, but good for you, because our recommendations are not influenced by anything or any prospect of further work. We're just here to give you the truth tonight and leave town. So there were two parts of the work: the feasibility study to determine what, if anything, is needed, and the business plan to talk about how facilities are programmed, operated, and sustained. The needs assessment is really the critical part, and the way that we attack that is through these four issues. One, is there an audience for new facilities? So who lives here and works here and visits here, and what do they like and what do they want? Are there enough of them to fill new facilities? Secondly, what's the level and nature of demand on the part of users? And if we bring them all together in a space, will it be busy? Third, what is the current supply of facilities, and what's either sort of missing or lacking in some way if there's a gap that we can fill? And then finally we say, where is your community going, and how might new arts facilities help you get there? So what are your goals around economic development and quality of life and cultural tourism? And we try and shape the project to be in alignment with those goals. So let's do the needs assessment. The first thing is, there's some very significant trends in performing arts facilities, and I'm just going to suggest to you how our world is changing because of those changes. First, we embrace a much broader definition of cultural activity that reflects the diversity, heritage, and creativity of all people. Arts facilities are no longer about dead European guys. Our expression of culture and creativity is much broader now. My favorite soundbite is we've shifted from Friday Night Lights to the idea of a community living room. So Friday Night Lights, the idea is that in the old days, people would show up to a fancy theater at 7 o'clock on a Friday night when the marquee would light up, wearing their fancy clothes to go to a fancy performance. The idea of a theater today is that it's a community living room. It's always open, it's always active, it's much more inclusive, and it really is much more engaged in the life of the community. We've shifted from this idea of palaces of culture, big sort of iconic structures, to cultural districts, spreading out elements of cultural facilities within an urban core. We've put a new focus on active programs, so not just passive participation in the arts, but active participation. A greater focus on the social experience of attending an event, which is really about food and beverage operations and public spaces. We really have to find ways to maintain a low cost of access for nonprofit arts groups. The economics of running a nonprofit are challenging, and it's not because they're not good business people, it's just the nature of creating art. And we also focus on the activation of secondary, temporary, and outdoor spaces. So on to Roswell. So you have a population approaching 100,000, but what we did was try and figure out how far away people travel to Roswell for events. So we did some mapping of audiences at the Cultural Arts Center and decided we wanted to look first at a 15-mile radius, and then we could look at the North Atlanta Metro. But the key for me is that in that 15-mile radius, there is a population already over 1.5 million that is probably headed to about 1.7 million by 2023, so a large market area. And then we looked at the demographics. The best predictor of arts participation is how far you go in school. So you see that, and for all these charts, the orange is Roswell, the red is the 15-mile radius, the blue is the North Atlanta metropolitan area, and the gray is the United States. So you see the high level of folks with graduate or professional degrees and with bachelor's degrees in Roswell, but also in that larger market area. Household income is also quite extraordinary for Roswell and also the larger region relative to the rest of the country. The age distribution is interesting. There are lots of 17 and unders. I should do my pointer. Lots of 17 and unders, but also a large group between the ages of 35 and 54 relative to the national average. So that could be sort of parents and kids or parents with kids recently left. You also have some racial and ethnic diversity in the community, notably a large Asian population, and when you get out to the 15 and 30 mile ring, a significant African American population. This is how we look at existing facilities. I'm afraid my presentation on the laptop, I lost the red in some of my dots, but the point is when we look at performance facilities, there are gaps. So these matrices are the way that we look at all facilities. So every dot is a building within 15 miles. So, and this is the rating of quality between 0 and 4, and this is the seating capacity. So locally, which are the blue dots, you have a reasonable set of facilities, but at low to moderate quality, and that's also the case when you get up to larger capacity. We've zeroed in on performance facilities here, just going up to 1,600, there again to highlight that gap there. We've also cataloged outdoor facilities, all the way from 1,000 to 19,000 seats, noting again, it isn't so much a capacity issue as it is a quality issue. The other thing we looked at were meeting and event facilities, because arts facilities often go into the meeting and event business as a way to improve their sustainability. And if we can find an opportunity to do that, we tend to encourage our clients to go down that road. So here, a significant opportunity for spaces between 250 and 500, we feel. Finally, we referred to a lot of the prior studies done in and for the city, from your comp plan to the economic development plan. We see that most of these documents have outlined goals for arts and culture for sort of arts reasons, like providing additional programs and opportunities. But the more important thing is that the community's goals for art and culture are driven by a much broader set of aims about quality of life, diversifying the economy, increasing cultural tourism, and building community identity. So where a project should respond to those. So in our assessment, we reached positive conclusions. We said the market is good, the size and the demographic characteristics are positive. We said that there are gaps within the existing inventory. We saw demand in the market for performance spaces. Sort of a lot of it was between 350 and 750 seats, but also the need for rehearsal, storage space, practice rooms, excellent acoustics, and potential partners. And finally, we determined that the project is in line with city goals, including those related to the provision of additional programs and achieving these other goals for the city. So that led us to make 3 recommendations. The first one, develop a facility for music education, meetings, and events. So this is a performing arts facility, and we were stressing an orientation to music, and then having in a capacity of 400 to 600 seats, another smaller second space. In that main hall, let's have some flexibility, so you could go cabaret style, dance floor, other types of seating arrangements. And then you would want to have private teaching studios and classrooms, storage space, and so on. Then our big sort of long-term recommendation is think about the possibility of working with other communities in the region to develop a year-round seasonal venue for outdoor entertainment. We see an opportunity, and this is something that sort of Fulton County, North Atlanta community should do together, because it's a larger scale project, really beyond the resources of one community. But as and when you're ready and there's a partnership desire with other communities, this would be a great project to pursue. And finally, we said fix the Cultural Arts Center. We think that it plays an important role in the cultural life of the city, and we've outlined some of these improvements. You know, there would be a way to do this. Ideally, when you build the new center, you bring the activity from the Cultural Arts Center over there, you do the renovation, and you move things back. I would also say the one issue that was a little bit controversial with the client, with the Roswell Arts Fund Performing Arts Center Feasibility Committee, who I reported to through this, they were sort of cautious and a bit ambivalent about my music first idea. There was a strong opinions on that group that we should include a stage tower in order to be more of a multi-purpose facility. And remember, a stage tower is that giant block that goes behind and above the stage that allows you to fly scenery and other things in and out. It's a fairly significant expense, but it allows you to support a broader range of projects. So fair enough, the group doesn't want to miss any programming ideas, but I would encourage you to hold on to that music first option as well for as long as you can, because I believe that it will lead to a better financial performance on the part of the building, and more importantly, it will give you a building that is distinctive within the region relative to Sandy Springs, relative to Johns Creek. So I finished my project in Johns Creek a couple months ago. They're going to do a multi-purpose room, probably about 800 seats, as well as to become the new home of the Johns Creek Arts Center. They're going to move the visual arts piece into that project as well. The concept has gone forward, and now we've helped them think about fundraising strategy, and now they've got to sort out how the project will be funded and then do proper fundraising feasibility. But I think there's a good concept there, but no funding to pay for it yet. So in any event, that my issue is hold on to the possibility of music first, because I think being regionally distinctive with what you do in Roswell is critically important to raise money for the project, to attract programs and audiences. All right, so into my business planning work. So we said, let's start with some goals. We want to contribute to the economic vitality of Roswell. We want to attract and support touring arts entertainment, provide affordable access to facilities for local and regional artists, and use a sustainable business model driven primarily by earned income as opposed to contributed income, grants, donations, and so on. So we worked up an activity profile, and there's a combination of nonprofit rentals. And nonprofit rentals are the sort of the mission part of the building, but they're significant economically because nonprofit arts organizations really can't afford to pay anything close to what we would consider to be sort of a market rate rent in an arts facility. There's commercial rentals, sort of businesses and meetings and events, educational programs, other produced programs, and presenting. And sort of presenting is where you buy, there's an artist touring through the region, you pay them a fee to come to your building, you do all the marketing yourself through the staff of the building, but you collect the ticket sales and hope that the money you collect is more than the money that you've put out to put on the show. So that's a good balance of activity to animate the building, but it's a hard job on the part of the executive director or facility manager to do that. So there are about 6 or 7 different models to look at the governance of these facilities. We quickly narrowed it down to 3. One, a new or existing nonprofit created for this purpose. 2, an educational institution, ideally a community college or a 4-year college, or a professional facility management organization. And there are companies like this around the country that come and offer to operate your building for you. You generally pay them a fee to do that, but they take the risk in some situations. This building is a little bit small, where we're headed in capacity to sort of get one of those firms in, but 10 years ago I would have said they wouldn't come near it, but more recently they've been sort of pitching for buildings. I just did a theater in Homestead, Florida, where a commercial operator is running this 400-seat historic theater that's inaugurated. So we never know. So my recommendation is that we start out with the Roswell Arts Fund as kind of the governing organization to advance the project, and that within that organization, they start building the skills and resources for the organization to run the venue as and when it opens, and they spin it out of the Arts Fund along the way. Now, when colleges and universities, when we identify those opportunities, I will encourage you to talk to them about programming and potentially operating partnerships, and let those professional facility managers come to you. It works a lot better when they're approaching you than when you're trying to convince them to come on. I won't go through this with you, but I want to suggest that in our business planning, we work through lots of details about how the facility is accessed and scheduled, and this idea of resident organizations and rental rates and ticketing and food and beverage and being green and so on. The highlight of the business plan was when we brought the groups that had been identified as users together in this room, in fact, and imagined that the building was about to open and talked about how it should be operated for their benefit. You know, what kind of rent they could pay and who gets first dibs on the calendar and all of that. It was a very constructive session, and it, I think, has served to make the arts community be good partners as the project moves forward. Right? They are engaged. So we did a staffing plan. You can see there are 7 full-time positions plus some part-time. The blues are the full-times. The greens are the part-time, and the reds are staff that are hired on just an event basis. That work allowed us to develop a pro forma operating budget, right? So what revenues and expenses are associated with the building through the first 5 years of operation. So you see there's a pre-opening year, and because you've got to put staff in place and start preparing to run the building before it opens. But then in year 1, the first thing we figure out is the earned revenue based on activity. So that was 1.2 million in ticket sales and rental income and programming and user fees and so on. Then we figure out the operating expenses, which in this case were 1.8 million, and you'll note how a lot of that is staff, right? The 878,000 in personnel in year 1. And then we come back to what is the annual funding requirement in order to sustain these facilities. So we've been through several iterations of this budget with the Arts Fund gang and talking and thinking about what is an annual funding requirement that is achievable within the community of Roswell. And we have sort of worked the numbers pretty hard in order to get to an annual funding number that our client felt comfortable moving forward with. So what goes wrong in these buildings? It's easy for me to sort of generate a pro forma operating budget, but lots of things go wrong. The rental demand turns out to be weak. You know, the groups that said they were going to use it don't materialize. You book touring acts, and you make either bad decisions or you don't market it effectively. You get low ticket sales, and then also poor management. And the thing that often happens is the community decides to hire someone from their community to run the building rather than hiring somebody who's run a similar building in another community. So how to mitigate those risks? First of all, we've done that, I think, with very conservative projections of use. Secondly, don't rely on one user. The more users, the better, to really sort of divert, it's like portfolio diversification. And third, hire based on relevant experience. There are lots of good people out there that run these facilities. They're not hard to find. There's sort of 6 places to post the job, and you can do that. And also have a board of directors that's focused and paying attention along the way. The last exercise was forecasting the economic impact of the building. And for this, we did it a couple of ways, but one way was through the Americans for the Arts has this thing called the Arts and Economic Prosperity Calculator, where you input a few numbers and we get a few numbers back. It's a little bit rough and approximate, but basically it says that in the 3rd year of operations, the building will generate in the community 108 jobs, and that's impacts of the organization spending money, and that's the impacts of the audiences spending money in the community. So 108 jobs, $2.2 million in new household income, $143,000 in new tax revenue for local government, and $200,000 for state government. So that's an annual ongoing impact with the project. The last thing we did was a critical path plan that shows how, moving forward with the project, you're now moving down 3 parallel tracks. The first track is around fundraising, so deciding how to finance and fund the project, and if you're having a capital campaign, initiating that campaign out in the community, including things like naming rights. I've estimated with the help of Paul and Glenn the timing of physical planning and design through these steps. I am going to make sort of 2 comments here. One is, though you have architects who've been working with you, I would urge you to consider a competitive bid process. It's a good way to get the best architects interested, to make sure that you get the best services, and even with the sort of current team, to make sure everyone's sharpening their pencil and giving you the best performance. The other recommendation I would make related to that is that you should hire independent contractors separately, and most importantly, theater consultants who care about the functionality of the space and performance equipment and so on, and acousticians. And particularly if you go down the road of a mostly music facility, you have to pay a lot of attention to room acoustics. So I believe they should be hired separately. I don't sort of believe this sort of argument that they can all be under one roof. It really doesn't cost you any more. And those independent perspectives, sort of the dynamic sort of conflict about from the different perspectives of architect, theater consultant, and acousticians will lead to a better building. The third section of this is just saying you can't start planning for operations when the building opens. You need to be working on this 2 years in advance, thinking about who becomes a resident organization, programming strategy, ticketing systems, how you're going to deal with food and beverage, rental rates, insurance, maintenance, capital, and so on. But if you do follow these steps and sort of proceed in a sort of methodical manner, I will be thrilled to come back and see you on a opening night, theoretically in the 4th quarter of 2022. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass it over to these guys. I've got to close my thing.
Before I start, do you have any questions for Duncan? That's a lot of information, I know.
We'll wait till you.
Great.
There you go.
Well, as Duncan, first of all, thank you for having us here. I'm Paul Szymborski. I'm a principal with DLR Westlake Reed Laskoski, and we've been at this since 1905. Duncan has done 430 studies. We've worked on a number of performing arts centers all over the country, new and renovations. And joining me is Glenn Johnson from our Charlotte studio. As Duncan said, his work is completing. The architect's work is really just sort of beginning. And we were first here in, and I don't know all of you, but I know some of you, we were first here in 2017 when we were retained by the Roswell Arts Fund through you to do some very initial planning and conceptualization. And we met with stakeholders as well. And we work hand in hand with Duncan. So his findings in terms of size of facility and type of facility is in keeping with what we will show and what we also support. And while Duncan has said that there's a strong propensity for a music venue, there have been others that said this venue, we should always think about, you know, all kinds of uses for it. So don't ignore drama. And we know much will change over time, but what the few things we're going to show will address these needs of music, of drama, of theater, of place of social engagement, of a welcoming environment, something that should really be the center of Roswell, that says, I've arrived. You've got this wonderful history here. Few cities in the South have that. You have this wonderful collection of porches and both new and old, and we think that's something you should build on. When we first came to town, we didn't know your town, and we, as architects doing conceptual work, working with someone like Duncan, our job is really to start to feel of what a facility, where a facility could be, and how big it could be. The hardest thing to do is to design a building when you don't have any given, you don't have any factors like design me a house. Great, how many bedrooms? How many parking spaces? What's your lifestyle? So we have to show you good information, we at least have to have a feel of the size of the facility and the feel of how many acres it takes. Otherwise, we would show you information that could be misleading. We've looked at well over 12 sites since we first came here in 2017, but we're not here to talk so much about sites. When we first arrived, we looked from the southern border to the northern border and from east to west, and we really felt the assets of your community are more along the lines of being, if I can say this, being more urban to Roswell. That being Canton Street, that being the cultural center here and the city in Roswell Square, that it should be, and this is our professional opinion, that it should be in this area where it could be reasonably walkable, if you would. And it should be many things. It shouldn't be a single venue or a venue doing a single thing. I like, and I wrote down what Duncan said years ago. This was, this sort of the Friday night special. Well, things have changed. Times have changed. These are places of social engagement that need to be programmed heavily to even have a chance of penciling out. So I wanted to just go through a few attributes that relate to different sites. We thought this should be, if it's a building, we thought it should be a building if it could. And it has all those things that Duncan talked about, 600 seats and rehearsal space or black box space. But we thought it should be a building, if it could, that has a presence on the street, that your first impression is not a parking lot, but your first impression is a building, something welcoming. And if sites, and again, I'm not going to talk about a specific site. We've looked at 12. There's probably more. I don't know what's ever going to be available for sale, if anything, but we had to look at a building of this size and a site of a certain size so we could at least do a test fit. But we thought the building should really be on the street. It should have those qualities of fronting the street. And again, having presence. We can go to the next slide. This is maybe the most extreme where it really gets up to the street. But depending on how your streets come together, whatever this site is, again, this can be something that's quite welcoming. That comes, you drive in on whatever street it is, Norcross, Atlanta, Alpharetta, from north to south, Magnolia. But if we could find a site that really says, I've arrived at Roswell, that's the site. Those are the kind of sites we should look at because it really wants to be a proud building. Let's give it another one. Again, the yellow always indicates a corner, if you will. The blue indicates these sort of performance venues, an auditorium, a black box, a rehearsal. That orangey color is sort of the stage or the stage house, depending on which way we go. And the gray is generally the support space. And these four colors move around in different ways depending on the site. Again, no two sites are the same. How we load into these buildings, where we park cars, where we drop off, how once we drop off we get into those buildings, they're all site specific. We're just going to show you one more. Again, looking at sites, no sites in particular, although there are some that are better than others. Again, can a lobby be really a front porch or the front door? And can you actually see through the lobby so that the arts are on display both in the performance venue and in the black box? And whether that performance venue is flat floor or raked, and raked meaning sloped, whether it's one floor or two floors, meaning having a balcony, and whether that it's a flat floor and raked or a combination thereof, we're just beginning. The architect's work is really just beginning. This is really about test fits. And then again, you get we did this 10 different times on 10 different sites, and it's the parts and pieces. We know the program. Glenn's going to go through the program for us, generally what the program is.
So we took Duncan Webb's recommendations, distilled them a little bit, and built a sample program based on venues that are like it, the nuances of some multi-purpose and specialized music, that sort of thing, program, and built a 150-item detailed program that included the main venues, as he noted, a 400 to 600 seat main theater space, and possibly an event space, a black box that could be very flexible of about 100 seats. And then layered on the support for that in the public spaces, spaces for functional purposes, but also for delight, art spaces, front door spaces for your community, engaging the street and the community, and those sorts of things. And then obviously you have your stage support, your venues, your whether it be a fly loft or acoustically augmented chamber, that sort of thing. And then you also have performer support, be that dressing rooms, star dressing rooms, rehearsal rooms, that sort of thing. And again, very much encompassed a lot of the spaces that Duncan talked about earlier. And then obviously the administration and building services component to it that is very necessary. And came out with really about a 44,000 square foot building as sort of a soft target. That's really where our intuition tells us this may come out. Obviously that's sort of the center of the sphere at this point. There's lots of different directions that could take, both specialized or multi-purpose, and you could add on pieces from the different community interests as well. So again, we're looking at right around 44,000 is where we think this might be. We also did a little bit of work on trying to put a budget to this. And again, this is going to be the sort of center of the sphere. There are facilities that do one thing very specialized at a high level, and there's facilities that work at a very broad scale and do lots of things. And then you also have spaces that are very functional and spaces that are a little bit higher end finishes, that sort of thing, more of a community centerpiece. So we did a study, and we took 12 venues with the historic data from 12 venues, and picked 4 venues that were very close to the 500 seat plus 100 seat event venue, and also that were constructed within the last 3 years. Did a projection based on those, and it's really telling us that the sort of benchmark cost that you might start to look at is right around $21 million for construction costs, and that puts it at around $473 a square foot. And again, the backup data is here for a number of the other venues, and they were geographically separated, but everything's been adjusted to this market in today's dollars. And then if you bring that down to the project level, you're looking at just over $23 million in project costs, or $529 a square foot.
These buildings are not office buildings. I think you all know that. As Duncan was saying, the acoustics are unique. Seating, fixed seating, there's cost for each seat, loose seating, risers, all of the MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. It's going to be zoned separately, so when the heating and cooling is on in the office space and nothing is going on in the auditorium, we don't turn that on. It has a separate system. So they're also a very restrictive building. They're high occupancy, institutional, which means the level of safety is higher. There's sprinkled buildings, there's fire codes, there's exit requirements, there's huge plumbing requirements for toilets. So when someone sees those numbers, their cost per square foot, the normal reaction is, I can do an office building at half that. This is not an office building. These numbers also include site work. So if the building is an acre, imagine that. The building is about an acre a square foot. Glenn showed 44,000. You're building an acre of building. Parking is another 2+ acres just for parking. So these numbers include the cost of the building, the cost of site work. And so we talked about, and it's tough to, like, where did you come up with that? We have to start. We found a love of your porches here when we first came to town. We love that some of your buildings are snuggled up to the street. Some are set back, but some are snuggled up to the street. And I think when they get snuggled up to the street a little bit, they can become a little bit more pedestrian. We want the building to be reasonably compact, because compact also means maybe a little bit more affordable, less square footage, but also, as Glenn said, able to expand. It's a performance center, but is it also a welcome center? Is it also a museum? Can it be a combination of both public and private? You have this wonderful collection of restaurants on Canton Street. How does any of those operations, if any of those operations, find their way into this kind of building? So I like to say it's both and. It's a performance center, and it's these other things, and it's welcoming, and it's a place to come for an event, and then you go to have dessert afterwards, or you come for a small performance in a black box, or if we call it the rehearsal, which is all the way to the left end of the screen there. But then you can also have a venue going on in the main auditorium, which is behind that drum. And we picked the drum just because we picked a corner site in this case. So that's an image. That's a place to start. All of these things change over time. But we think this should be a building that's grounded. We think we should embrace the public art also that you've started here, and find a way to knit that into the building and the site as you move forward. So that's some of the imagery we have for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Open it up to questions.
Council have questions or comments? Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all for the work you've done. It's one of the reasons that Susan and I moved to Roswell was the ability to leave our house, walk to different types of entertainment, all of the restaurants, all the other things that we can get to. And so it's very interesting to see something like this. I think the question that I'd ask, I think this might go to you, Duncan. Can you give us some ideas as to how communities you've worked with in the hundreds of projects you've been involved with, how do they fund these? How do they finance them?
Oh, Lord. Well, so I'm not a fundraising consultant. That's not my world. However, what I do know is that there's no one way. You'll come into one community where it's the public sector is funding the large share of the capital project, and the private sector is sustaining the building on an ongoing basis. And then 10 miles down the road, it's the opposite way. So the approach that I encourage is, first of all, determining what appetite you have as a city, either on the capital side, but also on the sustainability side. Then going out and determining how and through what means the private sector might participate through a capital campaign. We helped Johns Creek a little bit. We did a few, within our feasibility study, we sort of interviewed some individuals and sort of talked about a private campaign for up to 25 million there. The other tools are to include the project in a larger mixed-use development with a commercial developer. That was the solution that seems to make sense in Johns Creek. But you really have to dig into it. You know, the point is, I think tonight, with the information that we've provided and all of us together have provided, you have the ammunition to now go out and test the project from a funding perspective. So you can do that through a fundraising consultant, and there's some very good ones in and around the Atlanta area, or you can hire someone who has experience fundraising in Roswell, less experience with this type of project, but they know Roswell well, and maybe they can help you sort that out.
Next question, I think, would go to you all on the architect side. Your $23 million number, does that include, that's including land cost, land acquisition?
No,
Okay, thank you.
it doesn't include land acquisition, and it doesn't include, you know, let's say there's remedial work done because it was a gas station. It doesn't include that. It includes the cost of site work, civil. So civil is parking and the sewers and the utilities under that site. Thank you for asking the question. I would add to Duncan's, if I could, they're all different. We will find situations where the city might say, I can provide a certain amount of money, now raise the rest privately, and then the city may then be the steward of the building. We've come into these where it's largely philanthropy. And then that's, again, fundraising, and you have to have so much of that in place generally before you go, with lead gifts before you go into any kind of public announcement of these projects.
Yes. Thank you. This is very exciting and it's great to see it all come to life. I guess in terms of like a seed money or like a first step, I mean, based on your experience with some other projects that have been successful, what type of commitment do you think this need to start with?
From the city, if you...
From the city and or private donors, I mean, what is the catalyst that kind of helps it get started?
I'll start it, and then Duncan may want to add to that. If there's a lead gift from the city, I mean, clearly that would go a long way to show that kind of support. But I think we also then need to understand what comes with that seed money. When you get into private money, we normally, and again, I'm not a fundraising expert, but I've been at this long enough and seen enough of these, where 80% of that money needs to be in place before a project goes, is announced publicly. You know, they say 80% of the money comes from, 20% of the people, whatever the number is. We create, as architects, we create tools for you. The reason, if I backed up a little bit from when we showed this image, that it's not that I don't support it, it's that when you get into a project like this and there's outside interests, someone who wants to support the arts, we as designers want their input. We don't want to foist on them a design or even a program. We want to engage those folks, and we want to get their input. I'm not being evasive to answer the question. I just know that if you want to get people involved in these projects, if you want their money, you get them involved. Okay, on the private side. Duncan, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure. So the way you framed it is right. So there's at least one, if not two more rounds of seed capital before you do the big raise. So the question for you tonight is, what do we want to know next? And if I were in your position, I would say, one, how are we going to fund and finance this? And two, let's get more precise around site, physical concept, and capital budget. So raise 100 grand, say, to answer those next two questions. And from my perspective, the more sources of seed capital, the better. So get, business partners, individual partners, city, because the project needs to be framed as a community project, and you want community to be jumping in. So 100 grand to answer the next two questions, and then there'll be probably a couple of other questions. You raise a little bit more money to answer that, and then theoretically you're at the point where you go and raise the big money.
The site is the big nut here in a lot of ways. We don't know a site. Duncan demonstrated that there is a demand and you can support this. But the site's I look back at my notes, and one of the things was, as Duncan said, start to get serious on a site. But that'll come.
Additional questions, comments from council? Is there anyone in the public that would like to come forward and speak? Everybody's quiet tonight. Well, gentlemen, I think you did a great job, and that's why there aren't a lot of questions. Thank you again for being here this evening, and I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.